What happens when corrupt cops target the wrong man? Imagine a former Delta Force commander who's seen the worst battlefields on Earth now, facing a new enemy wearing badges. When they threatened his business, they thought he would bow down like everyone else. They had no idea who they were messing with, or what he was capable of doing to protect what's his. This is the story of Marcus Reid, whose liquor store became ground zero in a war against police corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. You'll witness how one man's stand against injustice exposed a massive conspiracy targeting minority businesses, the brutal fight that followed, and the extraordinary measures it took to bring down a system designed to crush anyone who resisted. If this is your first time on our channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the most compelling stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and the courage it takes to fight back against overwhelming odds. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's dive into this incredible true story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Avenue as Marcus Reid stood behind the counter of Reid Spirits and Fine Liquor, wiping down the polished wood surface with practiced precision. The amber light filtered through the dust particles hanging in the warm air, illuminating the rows of bottles that lined his shelves like silent sentinels. At 43, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and survived to tell the tale. 10 years earlier, Marcus had been halfway across the world, leading classified missions with the Delta Force, America's elite special operations unit. Back then, his days consisted of moving through hostile territories where danger was a constant companion, and split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The military had given him purpose, discipline, and a skill set few civilians could comprehend. But war couldn't last forever. Now, his battles were different, running a small but successful business in a neighborhood that was changing faster than many of its residents could adapt to. The liquor store had become his anchor, a piece of stability in a community that was increasingly being pushed and pulled by outside forces. Through the front window, Marcus watched as Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old grandmother who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, made her way toward his store. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, her warm smile immediately brightening the space. "Evening, Marcus," she greeted, placing a small bottle of peach brandy on the counter. "I see you still haven't fixed that flickering light outside. Going to give somebody a seizure one of these days." Marcus smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I keep meaning to, Mrs. Patterson. Just hasn't made it to the top of my list yet." She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him for a second, but she didn't press the issue as he rang up her purchase and carefully placed the bottle in a paper bag. The bell chimed again, but this time the atmosphere in the store shifted instantly. Marcus didn't need to look up to sense the change. Years of combat had honed his instincts to detect threat before it announced itself. He finished placing Mrs. Patterson's receipt in her bag, then calmly lifted his gaze to the two men standing just inside the entrance. Lieutenant James Porter and Officer Ryan Harper weren't there for liquor. Mrs. Patterson, oblivious to the tension suddenly filling the store, gathered her purchase and gave Marcus's arm a gentle pat. "You stay safe now, you hear?" Marcus nodded, offering her a reassuring smile as she made her way past the officers, who didn't bother stepping aside for her. She had to squeeze between them, an unspoken act of power and disrespect, before disappearing onto the sidewalk. As the door closed behind her, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of his muscles tensing, his senses heightening, his mind calculating angles and distances. Something was about to happen, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. Lieutenant Porter took his time surveying the store, his eyes sweeping over the neatly arranged bottles, the clean floors, the security cameras mounted in the corners. He had the look of a man who believed he owned every room he entered, broad-shouldered, confident in a way that only comes from years of operating without consequences. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a shine that caught the store's lighting at odd angles. Harper, on the other hand, was younger, cockier, with a permanent sneer etched onto his face, and something to prove. The kind of officer who joined a force for all the wrong reasons. He strolled toward the shelves. Harper made a noise in his throat, shaking his head as he continued to examine the bottles. A lot of these places got real lucky getting to stick around at all. Some folks just don't know how to appreciate that. His eyes flickered toward the black "Own Business" sticker near the register before giving Marcus a smirk. "Permits are getting real strict these days," Harper continued, glancing at the floor of the shelves like he was looking for something wrong. "Gotta be careful with those health codes. Can't have businesses letting things get too unsanitary." He ran a finger along a shelf and examined it theatrically. "Not saying there's a problem, but city officials might not see it that way." The message was clear. Marcus had seen this same scenario play out in countries across the world, different languages, different uniforms, but always the same game. "Protection tax," he said flatly. Porter gave him a small smile, as if amused by the term. "Call it what you want, but cooperation makes things easier for everybody. Pay a small monthly fee, and we make sure everything stays in order. That liquor license of yours won't run into any issues, health inspections smooth as can be." He straightened slightly. "And if, say, someone decided to try and break in here, well, we'd be the first ones on the scene." Marcus's fingers curled slightly against the countertop, but his expression remained unreadable. "And if I don't?" Porter let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. "Then you take a risk." Harper chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "A big risk. We had to shut down a couple places last month. Unfortunate paperwork issues." He glanced toward the front door. "And some of these neighborhoods, they get real unpredictable when the wrong people start hanging around. Place like this could be a whole different shop by next year. Something cleaner, classier." Marcus stayed silent for a long moment, letting the weight of their words settle in the air. He'd faced down warlords and terrorists, men who thought intimidation was power and fear was control. These two were amateurs playing a dangerous game with someone they didn't understand. With deliberate slowness, he reached for the register and hit the cash drawer shut without ringing anything up. "I'll pass," he said, folding his arms across his chest. Porter's smirk faltered slightly. Harper exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Man's making things difficult for himself," he muttered. Porter straightened his stance, nodding once as if confirming something in his head. Harper sighed and held up the whiskey bottle he'd been examining, giving it one last look before letting it slip from his fingers. The glass shattered against the floor, sending sharp echoes through the store. The smell of expensive alcohol spilled into the air immediately, strong and deliberate. Neither officer flinched. Porter took a slow step backward, adjusting his cuffs as he turned toward the door. "You're going to regret that, Reid," he said smoothly. We'll be back." The bell jingled again as they walked out, leaving Marcus alone with the broken glass and spilled liquor. He didn't move immediately, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid seeping between the floor tiles, the scent sharp and unmistakable. This wasn't just an offer or a threat. It was a promise. And the next time they came back, they wouldn't be asking. As he cleaned up the mess, Marcus's mind was already working, calculating. He had survived wars by understanding his enemies, by anticipating their moves before they made them. Porter and Harper thought they had the upper hand because they wore badges, because they had a system behind them. What they didn't know was that Marcus Reid had dismantled entire enemy networks, had faced opponents far more dangerous than corrupt cops looking for easy money. He reached under the counter and pressed a small button, downloading the security footage to a private server. If they wanted a war, he would give them one. Marcus locked up just after midnight, pulling the metal security gate down over the storefront and securing it with a heavy padlock. The neighborhood never truly slept, but the streets were quiet enough now, the occasional passing car sending beams of light stretching across the sidewalk. He stood for a moment, listening, watching, letting the night settle around him. Something in his gut felt off. Not fear, not paranoia. He knew the difference. This was something heavier, a weight pressing against his ribs, telling him he should have been ready for what was coming next. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head at himself. He had spent years in places where instincts were the only thing that kept a man breathing, but this was different. This was home, or at least it was supposed to be. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, the liquor store shrinking in the rearview mirror. By morning, everything would change. When he returned just after dawn, the damage was the first thing he saw. The front window was shattered, glass littering the sidewalk in uneven chunks, crunching under his boots as he approached. Deep gouges ran across the metal security gate, like someone had taken a crowbar to it, leaving jagged streaks behind. The old neon sign flickered above the door, struggling against the daylight. Marcus didn't move at first, just let the scene settle in front of him. The air was still, the city barely waking up, but there was a hush to the street. People had seen, had walked by, maybe slowed for a second, maybe even thought about calling someone before deciding it wasn't their business. He exhaled slowly and reached for his keys. The lock was broken, the metal twisted where it had been forced open. He pushed the door inward, the hinges creaking in protest. The scent of spilled liquor hit him first. Bottles had been smashed, their contents seeping into the wooden floors, soaking into the shelves. Cigars from the display case were scattered across the counter, some stomped out, some left untouched. The cash register was wide open, but nothing had been taken. Not a robbery, that much was clear. Marcus stepped inside, his boots careful over the debris. He had seen plenty of messes in his lifetime, but this was different. This was deliberate. Not just about destruction, it was a message. His stomach turned as he spotted something out of place near the back of the shelves, partially hidden beneath the wreckage. A small plastic bag torn at the edges, white powder clinging to its surface. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. They had been inside, and they had left him something to find. A slow inhale, measured and even, his mind already running through the next steps. They would show up soon, maybe a patrol car just happening to drive by, maybe someone responding to a concerned citizen's call. They would step inside, glance at the damage, pretend to care, and then they'd find it, right there in plain sight. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing his shoulders to stay loose, keeping his pulse steady. He had seen plenty of setups before, just never one with his name on it. His hands curled into fists at his sides. They wanted him out, and if he wasn't going to leave willingly, they would make sure he didn't have a choice. Marcus had barely finished sweeping up the broken glass when the first squad car pulled up, the low hum of the engine settling into the quiet morning like a slow, moving storm. The sound was deliberate, an announcement of their presence meant to be felt before it was fully seen. A second car followed, rolling in smoothly, its tires pressing against the curb in an unspoken claim of control. Then came a third, sealing off the street in a way that made it clear this was not some casual patrol. He had expected them. The sun had barely risen, and the neighborhood was still rubbing sleep from its eyes, but already people were watching. A few shop owners stood behind their glass windows, their gazes cautious, calculating. A man walking his dog slowed his pace, eyes flicking toward the commotion before deciding it was safer to keep moving. The weight of their stares pressed into the air, not loud, not overt, but present. No one wanted to be involved, but no one could look away either. The driver's door opened first, followed by the sound of boots scraping against the pavement. Porter stepped out, his uniform crisp, his movements as unhurried as ever, as if he had all the time in the world. His face carried that same unreadable expression, a practiced neutrality that masked something far more dangerous beneath. The way his gaze swept over the damage, the shattered window, the boarded-up glass, the fresh marks where spray paint had been scrubbed away, told Marcus everything he needed to know. Harper followed closely behind, his movements sharper, more agitated. Unlike Porter, he wasn't trying to hide anything. His anger sat just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to spill over. Two more officers climbed out of the second squad car, positioning themselves near the storefront in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't casual either. Their presence wasn't necessary for what this was supposed to be, but that was the point. Marcus exhaled through his nose, fingers unconsciously tightening around the broom handle before forcing himself to let go. They weren't here to talk. Porter approached first, stepping over the scattered bits of broken glass with the same ease as someone strolling through a park. His eyes flicked briefly to the mess before settling back on Marcus. He let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking, his tone calm, conversational, like they were just two men discussing business. Busy morning. Marcus didn't rise to it. He kept his grip loose as he leaned the broom against the counter, meeting Porter's gaze without hesitation. Yeah, you could say that. Porter exhaled slowly, a faint nod accompanying his next words. Funny thing, we got an anonymous tip about this place. Said there's been some suspicious activity going on here. He raised an eyebrow. That sound about right to you? Marcus didn't respond, didn't shift, didn't blink. Porter let the silence settle for a moment before tilting his head slightly toward one of the officers behind him. Miller, why don't you take a look inside, just to be sure? Miller, a stocky officer with a scar cutting along his chin, stepped forward, already unhooking the latch on his holster like he was anticipating resistance. You got a warrant for this? Marcus asked, his voice level, betraying nothing. Porter gave him a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Why would we need one? You got nothing to hide, right? Marcus exhaled sharply, shaking his head once in quiet frustration before stepping aside. It wouldn't have mattered what he said, they were going in regardless. He had seen this before. Miller and the other officer moved through the store with the kind of controlled carelessness that wasn't about searching, but about disrupting. They knocked over bottles that didn't need to be. Knocked over, shifted shelves that didn't need adjusting. It wasn't an investigation, it was a performance. Marcus leaned against the counter, waiting. It didn't take long. "Well, well," Miller called from the back, his voice carrying an exaggerated sense of amusement. "Looks like we got ourselves a little problem here." Porter turned, raising an eyebrow in mock curiosity before nodding toward the rear of the store. "Let's take a walk." The city blurred past as Marcus drove, his body running on instinct while his mind calculated his next move. Blood seeped from the gash in his side where Harper's bullet had grazed him, and his ribs throbbed with every breath from the beating he'd taken. But pain was an old companion, one he knew how to push aside when survival was on the line. He'd barely escaped the confrontation at his store. When Miller had discovered the planted drugs, Porter had made his move. But they hadn't expected Marcus to fight back with the precision and ferocity of a trained operator. The ensuing chaos had given him just enough opportunity to break free and escape, but not before grabbing something crucial: Porter's encrypted phone, left momentarily unattended during the fight. Now, driving a stolen car with a bullet wound in his side, Marcus knew he was a wanted man. The official report would paint him as a violent criminal who assaulted police officers and fled the scene. His fingerprints were in the system from his military service. His face would be on every patrol car's computer, and Porter would use every resource at his disposal to find him. Marcus pulled into an abandoned warehouse district and parked between two derelict buildings. He needed to assess his injuries, gather his thoughts, and examine what he'd stolen. The wound on his side wasn't deep, but it needed attention. He pulled the first aid kit from his go bag, something he'd always kept in his truck, another habit from his military days that civilians found paranoid but operators knew as essential. With practiced movements, he cleaned and dressed the wound, breathing through the sting of antiseptic on torn flesh. His ribs were likely cracked, not broken. He'd felt the distinction enough times to know the difference. A tight wrap would have to do for now. Once patched up, Marcus turned his attention to Porter's phone. As expected, it was encrypted, but this wasn't his first time breaking into secured communications. During his time with Delta, he'd received specialized training in counter, intelligence, and electronic warfare. It would take time, but he could crack it. 2 hours later, the screen unlocked, revealing a treasure trove of information that made Marcus's blood run cold. This wasn't just about protection money or harassing local businesses. Porter's unit was running an elaborate operation, confiscating weapons during raids and selling them back to criminal organizations, seizing drugs from small-time dealers and reselling them through their own network, and most disturbing, systematically targeting minority-owned businesses for harassment and closure. Text messages between Porter and someone named VR outlined the strategy clearly. Target identified on Monroe St. Black. Own been there 15 years. Start the pressure next week. Jefferson Avenue shop refusing to sell. Increase pressure. Plant something if you have to. Client wants a whole block by Q3. Make it happen. Marcus scrolled further, finding a recurring name. Vincent Reynolds, a major real estate developer who had been buying up properties across the neighborhood at suspiciously low prices. The connection was clear. Porter's unit would harass business owners, fabricate violations, plant evidence if necessary, and force them to sell. Reynolds would swoop in with low-ball offers, and once the properties were acquired, luxury developments would replace the community staples. It wasn't just corruption, it was systematic displacement of an entire community. Marcus needed help, but he couldn't go to the police. Porter's influence likely extended throughout the department. He needed someone he could trust, someone on the inside who wasn't part of the corruption. Detective Samuel Morgan. They'd met years ago when Marcus had helped the detective with information about a gang operating near his store. Morgan was old school, a cop who still believed in protecting and serving rather than intimidating and profiting. If anyone would listen, it would be him. Marcus used a burner phone to make the call, keeping it brief. "Morgan, it's Reid. We need to talk. It's urgent." He gave a location, an abandoned lot near the river, and ended the call before waiting for a response. He arrived early, positioning himself with clear sight lines and multiple exit routes. It was instinct, the same tactical awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Headlights appeared 30 minutes later, moving slowly along the cracked pavement before stopping a few yards away. Detective Morgan stepped out first, cautious, scanning the shadows before settling his eyes on Marcus. The detective looked older than Marcus remembered, the lines deeper on his face, the weight of years spent fighting against a system that didn't want to be fixed. "You better have something worth this risk," Morgan muttered, walking toward him. Marcus pulled out Porter's phone and tossed it to him. "Take a look." Morgan caught it, his face unreadable as he scrolled through the messages, photos, and documents. His shoulders stiffened with each swipe, his breathing changed, and finally he exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "This is real?" he asked, though his expression said he already knew the answer. Marcus nodded. "Real enough to get me killed." Morgan let out a long breath, staring at the phone like it was something dangerous, because it was. "Jesus, Marcus. Your people won't help you with this," Marcus said. "You know that." The detective's silence was confirmation enough. After a long moment, he pulled out his own phone and made a call. "We need to meet," he said to whoever was on the other end. Marcus didn't ask who. He just got into the car. The meeting was already set when they arrived. Marcus had heard of FBI agent Nora Winters before. She had built a reputation for integrity and relentlessness. For 3 years, she had been investigating police corruption in the city, particularly focused on Porter's unit, but had never been able to gather enough evidence to make anything stick. Now she stood near a black SUV, arms crossed, her face hard, her posture guarded. She didn't look surprised to see Marcus. Detective Morgan must have briefed her on the drive over. "Detective Reid tells me you've got something I should see," she said as they approached. Marcus handed her the phone without a word. Winters scrolled through the messages, her eyes narrowing with each line. She took her time, absorbing everything, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. "This is good," she said finally. "Really good. But it's not enough." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Not enough. That phone ties them to gun running, extortion, real estate fraud. What else do you need?" Winters looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Names, contracts, something that ties Reynolds directly to these deals. A message saying pressure the neighborhood won't get us a conviction. I need financials. I need proof of intent." Marcus exhaled, forcing himself to push down his frustration. He knew she was right. It wasn't enough to expose them, They needed to bury them so deep they could never crawl back out. Reid shifted beside him. Then we need to talk to Sarah Chun. Sarah Chun owned a family diner on the East Side, a neighborhood institution that had served comfort food for nearly 3 decades. Her business had been one of the first targeted when Porter's unit started working with Reynolds' people. Winters pulled up a file on her tablet, showing the progression. Sarah's business had started receiving citations for minor health code violations. Then parking restrictions appeared overnight in front of her restaurant, followed by random police searches that disrupted business. When she protested to the city council, she was arrested for disorderly conduct. After months of harassment and mounting legal fees, she'd been forced to sell. Reynolds' company had acquired the property 2 weeks later for less than half its market value. Marcus stared at the pattern, his fists clenching. It was exactly what they were trying to do to him, what they had done to dozens of other business owners across the city. "Where is she now?" he asked. "She's been keeping a low profile since losing the restaurant," Winters replied. "But she's been documenting everything. Every citation, every police visit, bank statements showing the financial impact. She even collected similar stories from other business owners who experienced the same pattern. If we can tie any of those properties directly to Reynolds, it's over," Morgan added. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been bulldozed by Porter's operation, about a community being systematically dismantled for profit. Sarah Chen's apartment was modest, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood far from her former restaurant. Her eyes widened when she opened the door to find an FBI agent, a detective, and a man she recognized from neighborhood business meetings standing outside. "Ms. Chun," Agent Winters began, "we need to talk about Lieutenant Porter and what happened to your restaurant." Sarah's expression hardened, but she stepped aside to let them in. The small living room was neat but sparse, a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling diner she had once owned. "What's there to talk about?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They took everything. I fought. I filed complaints. I went to the city council. No one would listen." "We're listening now," Marcus said quietly. Sarah studied him for a moment. "You're the liquor store owner. From Reid's." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "They came for you too, didn't they?" Marcus nodded. She moved to a bookshelf and pulled down a large binder, then placed it on the coffee table. "I kept records of everything. Every bogus citation, every random inspection, every time an officer showed up to harass my customers." Agent Winters opened the binder, revealing meticulously organized documentation. Photos of police officers entering the restaurant, copies of citations with inconsistent violations, bank statements showing the financial decline as the harassment intensified. "They started small," Sarah explained, her fingers tracing over the pages. "A noise complaint here, a health code violation there. Nothing serious. Just enough to require payments for re-inspections, enough to start eating into my margins." She flipped to another section. Then they escalated. Customers being stopped as they left, questioned about suspicious activity. Officers would park outside during our busiest hours, deterring people from coming in. The pattern was painfully familiar to Marcus, the same tactics Porter had started using on him. "When I complained to the city, things got worse," Sarah continued. "Someone broke our windows one night. The police report said it was local kids, but no investigation was ever conducted. Then they planted drugs in our storage room during a routine inspection." Her voice wavered slightly. My family built that restaurant from nothing. My parents worked 16-hour days for years to make it successful. And Porter's people took it all in just 4 months. Agent Winters studied a document showing the property transfer. Reynolds' company acquired the property 2 weeks after you sold. Sarah nodded. Through a shell company at first, but it was him. He's buying up the whole neighborhood. Not just my place, at least 12 other businesses owned by minorities, all forced out the same way. She pulled out more documents, property records, showing how each business had been acquired below market value, then transferred to Reynolds Development Group. But the most damning piece of evidence was a ledger, financial records from one of Reynolds' former assistants who had been troubled by the pattern and had copied documents before quitting. The ledger detailed everything: payments to Porter's unit, lists of targeted properties, timeline projections for acquisition, and profit forecasts once the neighborhood had been revitalized. Agent Winters took photos of each page, her expression growing harder with each revelation. "This is excellent documentation, Ms. Chun. But we need concrete evidence linking Porter directly to Reynolds, communications, recorded meetings, anything that proves they're working together deliberately." Sarah hesitated, then reached for a small voice recorder. "I tried to record Porter when he came to threaten me one last time before I sold. It's not perfect, but—" She pressed play, and Porter's voice filled the room. "Look, the decision's been made at levels way above your pay grade. This neighborhood's changing. Either you sell now and walk away with something, or we keep finding problems until you're worth nothing. Reynolds already has plans drawn up for this block." Winters smiled for the first time since they'd met. "That helps, but we need more. Physical evidence from their operation." Marcus had been quiet, absorbing everything, connecting dots in his mind. "I know where to get it." All three turned to him. "Porter's unit uses a warehouse on the outskirts of town. I saw it mentioned in the texts," Marcus explained. "It's where they store everything, the seized weapons, the drugs, probably financial records too. If we want to bring them down, that's where we'll find what we need." Agent Winters shook her head. "We can't just break into a police facility without a warrant, and I can't get a warrant based solely on messages from a phone you stole." "I wasn't asking for permission," Marcus said quietly. "I have the training to get in and out undetected. If I can photograph their records, find concrete evidence linking them to Reynolds, you'll have enough for your warrant." "That's suicide," Morgan protested. "If they catch you." "They won't," Marcus cut him off. "This is what I was trained for." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Agent Winters spoke. "I can't know about this. I can't sanction it. But if evidence were to anonymously find its way to my office—" She let the implication hang in the air. Marcus nodded. He understood the rules of this game. Tonight, he would become a ghost again, slipping behind enemy lines for one more mission. The stakes had never been higher, but then again, neither had the cause. The warehouse loomed against the night sky, a hulking shadow at the edge of the industrial district. Marcus observed it from his position 200 yards away, hidden among abandoned shipping containers. The building's exterior was nondescript, weathered brick, few windows, a loading dock and a rear, perfect for operations that needed to remain unseen. Security was minimal but strategic. 2 patrol officers at the main entrance, surveillance cameras covering the perimeter, and motion-activated lights near access points. Porter's arrogance had made him careless. He never expected anyone to target a police facility. Marcus had spent hours planning this infiltration, studying patrol patterns and blind spots. He'd come prepared, dark tactical clothing, a small camera, lock picks, and enough knowledge of police protocols to anticipate their security measures. This wasn't his first covert operation, just the first on American soil. At 2:17 a.m., he made his move. The patrol officers had just completed their rounds, leaving a 4-minute window before they returned to the south side. Marcus moved silently across the open ground, keeping to shadows, his footsteps deliberate and soundless. He reached the building's blind spot, a maintenance door partially concealed by an electrical box, and made quick work of the lock. Inside, the warehouse air hung thick with the smell of motor oil, rusted steel, and dust. Dim emergency lights cast long shadows through rows of stacked crates, turning the space into a maze of steel and concrete. Marcus moved with quiet precision, each step calculated, his breathing measured. He wasn't rushing, he was hunting. Voices echoed from the far end of the warehouse. "Shipments coming in Friday. Reynolds already has the cash lined up," one said. Another voice responded, "Same accounts? No running it through the redevelopment fund this time." "Hell no. Porter doesn't want anything linking back to him directly." Marcus's fingers tightened. That was it. Proof that city funds, money meant for the very communities they were targeting, were being stolen and funneled straight into Reynolds' developments. He moved closer, keeping to the shadows, and spotted a small office where the voices were coming from. Through the half-open door, he could see ledgers and paperwork spread across a desk. Waiting until the officers moved away, Marcus slipped into the office and quickly photographed each document. The evidence was damning: lists of properties targeted for acquisition, payment schedules to officers, profit projections once the undesirable elements had been removed from the neighborhood. Everything they needed to bring down Porter, and Reynolds was right here. A sound caught his attention, footsteps approaching the office. Marcus moved quickly, shifting into the shadows behind a filing cabinet. The door swung open, and Officer Miller stepped inside. The stocky cop scanned the room, eyes narrowing as he spotted the open desk drawer. His head turned slightly, enough for him to catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows. For a brief second, neither man moved. Then Miller went for his gun. Marcus was already there. He grabbed the officer's wrist before the weapon cleared the holster, twisting it hard. Miller grunted, trying to break free, but Marcus shifted his weight and drove a sharp elbow into his jaw. The officer's head snapped back, his grip loosening just enough for Marcus to wrench the weapon from his hand and toss it aside. Miller swung wildly, but Marcus ducked the strike and countered with a brutal knee to his ribs. The force sent the officer stumbling backward, his shoulder crashing into the filing cabinets. Before he could recover, Marcus grabbed him by the back of his vest, twisted him around, and slammed him face first onto the desk. "Stay down," Marcus warned, his voice low. Miller struggled, but Marcus had already secured his wrists with the officer's own zip ties. His cover was blown. It was time to go loud. As Marcus stepped back into the main warehouse, a shout rang out from across the room. "Hey, who tied up Miller?" The entire atmosphere shifted. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest crate and shoved it forward, sending a stack of metal pipes crashing onto the floor. The noise was deafening, echoing through the massive space. "Who's there?" an officer called out, drawing his weapon. Marcus moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years in combat zones. He covered the distance in 3 quick strides, slamming a fist into the closest officer's jaw. The man staggered, gun slipping from his grip. Marcus caught it midair and used the butt of the weapon to strike another approaching officer. Shouts echoed through the warehouse as more of Porter's men realized they were under attack. Marcus weaved between crates, using the confusing layout to his advantage. Years of special operations had taught him how to turn chaos into an ally, how to make confusion a weapon. One by one, he disabled Porter's men, not killing them, but making sure they couldn't follow. A strike to the knee here, a carefully placed blow to the sternum there. His movements were economical, precise, the product of thousands of hours of training and real-world application. "Where's Porter?" someone yelled in panic. "On his way," came the response. Marcus exhaled slowly. Good. He wanted Porter here. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about forcing a confrontation that couldn't be covered up. The officers tried to coordinate, to form a perimeter and trap him inside, but Marcus had already anticipated their tactics. He planted small diversionary charges, not enough to cause serious harm, but sufficient to create the confusion he needed. When the first small explosion erupted near the fuel drums, panic broke out. Smoke filled the space, alarms blared, and in the chaos, Marcus made his way toward the exit, the flash drive of evidence secure in his pocket. He was almost free when a familiar voice cut through the smoke. "I should have known it was you, Reid." Porter stood at the far end of the warehouse, his stance casual, his expression caught between annoyance and amusement. Unlike his men, he didn't appear rattled by the chaos around them. "Always had to be the hero, didn't you?" Porter continued, stepping forward. "Could have just paid like everyone else, could have looked the other way. But men like you never learn when to quit." Marcus didn't respond. He was calculating distances, angles, the positions of Porter's remaining men who were starting to encircle him. "You know what happens now, right?" Porter's hand rested on his holstered weapon. "You broke into a police facility, assaulted officers. Nobody's going to question what happens to you here." As he spoke, the warehouse doors burst open, and more officers poured in, weapons drawn. Marcus knew he was outnumbered, but he had what he came for. All he needed now was a way out. "It's over, Porter," Marcus finally said. "I've got everything, the ledgers, the recordings, the connection to Reynolds. It's already been sent to the FBI." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Porter's face, quickly replaced by cold anger. "You're lying." "Am I?" Marcus took a step back toward the section of the warehouse where he'd spotted an emergency exit. "Agent Winters has been building a case against you for years. All she needed was evidence. Now she has it." Porter's expression darkened. "Kill him," he ordered his men. "Make it look clean." Gunfire erupted, forcing Marcus to dive behind a stack of metal containers. The shots pinged off steel, sending sparks flying. He was trapped, outgunned, with limited options. Then his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, northeast corner. 30 seconds. Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his last diversionary device, and tossed it toward the largest collection of fuel drums. The resulting explosion wasn't deadly, but it created enough smoke and confusion for him to make a dash toward the northeast corner of the warehouse. As he burst through the emergency exit, he found Detective Morgan waiting in an unmarked car, engine running. "Took you long enough," Morgan said as Marcus dove inside. The car peeled away just as Porter's men emerged from a warehouse, firing wildly into the night. "Did you get it?" Morgan asked as they sped away. Marcus pulled the flash drive from his pocket. "Everything we need." What neither of them knew was that Porter had one more move to make, one that would force Marcus into a final confrontation where the stakes would be higher than ever. The next morning, as Marcus and Agent Winters were reviewing the evidence, the call came in. Porter had taken Sarah Chun hostage. The weight of revelation fell heavily on the city in the weeks that followed. What had begun as one man's stand against corruption had uncovered a network that reached into every corner of local government. The evidence Marcus had gathered from the warehouse proved irrefutable. Detailed financial records showing kickbacks to officers, lists of targeted businesses, and most damning of all, direct communications between Porter and Reynolds outlining their strategy to cleanse neighborhoods for redevelopment. When the FBI raided Reynolds' offices, they discovered even more. Offshore accounts holding millions skimmed from public development funds, falsified permits approved by bribed officials, and evidence that the operation extended beyond Porter's unit to include judges, city inspectors, and even 2 council members. The confrontation at the abandoned train yard had been the final piece. Porter, desperate and cornered, had kidnapped Sarah Chun as leverage, demanding Marcus come alone. It had been a trap, but one that Marcus turned against its creator. The ensuing fight had been brutal, but this time Porter had no backup, no system to protect him. When police reinforcements arrived, ones not under Porter's influence, they found the lieutenant defeated, Sarah safe, and irrefutable evidence of his crimes. His arrest had been broadcast live across local stations, the image of the once untouchable officer in handcuffs becoming the symbol of a turning point for the city. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the newly reopened Reid Spirits and Fine Liquor, surveying the restored shelves and polished countertops. The physical wounds from his encounters with Porter and his men had healed, though some mornings his ribs still ached with the memory of that brutal beating. The bell above the door jingled, and Sarah Chun entered, carrying a small box of pastries from her newly reopened diner. "Grand reopening gift," she said, placing the box on the counter. "Figured you could use something sweet after everything bitter." Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "How's business?" "Better than ever," Sarah replied. "The neighborhood's coming back, but on our terms this time. The Community Development Fund is actually being used for the community now." The trials had been swift and decisive. Porter had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for corruption, extortion, evidence tampering, drug trafficking, and kidnapping. His most loyal officers received similar sentences. Those who cooperated faced lesser charges, but none would ever wear a badge again. Vincent Reynolds had fallen just as hard. The real estate magnate who had once dined with mayors and governors was now serving 30 years for racketeering, fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. His empire had been dismantled, his assets seized, and the properties he had stolen were being returned to their rightful owners through a community restoration program. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. A civilian oversight board now monitored police activities, body cameras were mandatory, and community outreach had become a central focus. It wasn't perfect. Systemic change never is, but was a start. "Did you see the news this morning?" Sarah asked, leaning against the counter. "They're officially renaming the community center after Mrs. Patterson." Marcus nodded. The elderly woman who had been one of his first customers had become a powerful voice in the rebuilding process, rallying neighbors and ensuring that the new developments included affordable housing and spaces for local businesses. "She deserves it," he said simply. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with activity. Where boarded-up storefronts had once dominated, shops were reopening. Families walked the sidewalks without fear of harassment, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of ownership and pride returning to the community. Detective Morgan, now promoted to lead a new anti-corruption task force, had become a regular visitor to both Marcus's and Sarah's businesses. He'd been instrumental in the reform efforts, using his inside knowledge to root out remaining pockets of corruption. Agent Winters had moved on to other investigations, but occasionally sent updates on how the case was being used as a model for similar operations in other cities. "You could have left, you know," Sarah said after a moment of comfortable silence. "After it all came out, you could have gone anywhere, started fresh." Marcus looked around the store at the walls his own hands had repaired, at the community notices pinned to the bulletin board, at the familiar faces that passed by the window. "This is home," he said simply. "Always has been." Sarah smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Well, I for one am glad you stayed. Someone needs to keep an eye on things." As she left, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished surface behind the counter. He wasn't just a store owner anymore, nor was he still the Delta Force operator he'd once been. He was something in between, a guardian who had found his purpose not in far-off battlefields, but in the everyday struggle for justice in his own community. The bell jingled again as a new customer entered, and Marcus turned with a smile. The fight for the soul of the neighborhood had been won, but the work of keeping it strong had only just begun. 1 year to the day after Porter's arrest, Marcus stood on the rooftop of his building, looking out over the neighborhood as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. The changes were visible from this vantage point: renovated storefronts with their original character preserved, new trees planted along the sidewalks, and most importantly, the same families who had lived here for generations still walking the streets, still calling this place home. Sarah joined him, handing him a cup of coffee as she leaned against the railing. They'd fallen into an easy friendship over the past year, fellow survivors of a battle that had nearly cost them everything. "Reynolds's appeal was denied," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Final ruling came down this morning." Marcus nodded. He'd expected as much, but it was still good to hear. Some of Reynolds's political allies had tried to intervene, to mitigate the damage, but the evidence had been too overwhelming, the public outrage too intense. "And the community land trust?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "Approved unanimously. 20 blocks protected from large-scale development for the next 50 years. Any new building has to include at least 30% affordable housing and space for local businesses." It was a victory that went beyond justice for past wrongs. It was protection against future attempts to displace the community, a safeguard that would outlast them both. Below, Mrs. Patterson walked slowly down the sidewalk, pausing to chat with neighbors tending to new planters outside their shops. The 73-year-old had become something of a local legend, testifying before the city council with a fierceness that had made even hardened politicians wince. "You know," Sarah said, watching the scene below, "most people would have just moved on after what you went through. Found somewhere easier." Marcus took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. "Easy isn't always right." She chuckled. "Is that some Delta Force motto?" "No," he replied. a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. That's just life. They stood in silence for a moment longer, watching as the streetlights began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that had faced darkness and emerged stronger. "They'll try again," Sarah said finally. "Maybe not tomorrow or next year, but eventually. Different faces, same game." Marcus set his empty cup on the ledge, his expression calm but resolute. "And we'll be ready." Some battles weren't fought with weapons or tactics. Some were fought with persistence, with community, with the quiet determination to stand your ground when the world tried to move you aside. It was a different kind of war, but one worth fighting all the same. The city never truly sleeps. Even in the deepest hours of night, it breathes, a living entity with concrete arteries and steel bones. For those who know how to listen, its rhythm tells stories of struggle, of power, of the constant push and pull between those who build communities and those who see only profit margins. Marcus Reid understood this language better than most. As he drove through the darkened streets toward his meeting with Agent Winters, the city spoke to him in familiar tones, the distant wail of sirens, the bass thrum of music from a late-night club, the hollow echo of footsteps down empty alleys. Each sound a piece of the urban symphony that had become his home after years in war zones where different sounds meant different dangers. Time moves differently in moments of confrontation. When Porter's men surrounded Marcus in the warehouse, seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into what felt like hours. Each movement became deliberate, each decision weighted with consequence. The muscle memory from years of training took over, transforming his body into a weapon that responded without conscious thought. This wasn't the calculated violence of the battlefield, where enemies were clearly defined and objectives were sanctioned by command. This was something more personal, more primal, the instinct to survive, to fight against injustice that had grown too bold, too comfortable in its power. As he moved through the smoke-filled space, dodging gunfire and systematically disabling Porter's men, Marcus felt a strange clarity descend. This warehouse, with its shadows and steel and danger, was more familiar than the quiet life he'd tried to build. Perhaps that's why he had never truly left the warrior behind. Some part of him had always known that battle would find him again. The morning after the warehouse raid, sunlight crept through the blinds of the safe house, casting striped shadows across the evidence spread on the table. Photographs of ledgers, recorded conversations, financial documents, the anatomy of corruption laid bare under the harsh light of day. Agent Winters moved between them with methodical precision, organizing, categorizing, building the case that would bring down Porter and Reynolds. Outside, the city continued its routine, unaware that the foundations of power were shifting beneath its streets. Commuters crowded onto buses, shopkeepers raised their security gates, children made their way to school, the everyday rhythms unchanged while something monumental took shape in this quiet room. Marcus watched Winters work, his body still aching from the previous night's confrontation. There was something compelling about watching justice take form, about seeing the scattered pieces of truth assembled into something that even the powerful couldn't ignore. The abandoned train yard existed in a strange liminal space, neither fully claimed by the city nor fully surrendered to nature. Rusted tracks curved between overgrown weeds, forgotten boxcars loomed like sleeping giants, and the skeletal remains of old loading equipment reached toward the sky like industrial sculptures. It was a place out of time, perfect for a confrontation that existed outside the normal boundaries of law and order. As Marcus approached the meeting point, moonlight gleamed off puddles from a recent rain, turning ordinary water into mirrors that reflected the broken landscape around them. In the center of it all stood Porter, his uniform abandoned for civilian clothes, his official authority replaced by the more primitive power of a man holding a hostage. Sarah knelt beside him, duct tape across her mouth, fear and defiance warring in her eyes. The scene had a terrible simplicity to it, the corrupt officer making his last stand, using an innocent life as leverage. Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle around him. This was the culmination of weeks of violence and revelation, the point where everything would either break or begin to heal. Courtrooms have their own unique tension, a contained pressure that builds beneath the formal procedures and legal language. During Porter's trial, that pressure was almost tangible, pressing against the high ceilings and wood-paneled walls as witnesses took the stand one by one. Former officers testified against their lieutenant, their faces tight with the strain of betraying the brotherhood they'd once valued above all else. Business owners recounted years of harassment and extortion, their voices sometimes breaking with the relief of finally being heard. Financial experts traced the movement of money through shell companies and offshore accounts, mapping the anatomy of greed with spreadsheets and bank records. Through it all, Porter sat impassive at the defense table, his expression revealing nothing. Only when Marcus took the stand did something shift in the former officer's eyes, a flicker of hatred, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Two warriors from different worlds, facing each other one final time across the battlefield of justice. Rebuilding happens slowly in increments almost too small to notice day by day. It's only when you step back, when you compare today with 6 months ago, that the change becomes visible. As spring melted into summer, and then hardened into fall, the neighborhood around Reid's spirits transformed in these small but meaningful ways. The community garden that had been neglected for years now overflowed with vegetables and flowers, tended by volunteers who gathered on weekends to weed and water and share news. The elementary school received a grant for new playground equipment, the bright colors of slides and climbing structures visible from blocks away. Storefronts that had been boarded up reopened with fresh paint and hopeful owners, selling everything from handmade clothing to home, cooked meals from family recipes. Most significant were the changes that couldn't be seen, the renewed sense of ownership among residents, the strengthened connections between neighbors, the belief that this place belonged to the people who lived here rather than to developers with blueprints for luxury condominiums. Marcus observed these transformations with quiet satisfaction as he went about his daily routine. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one victory against corruption would permanently solve the community's challenges. Power would always seek new avenues, new vulnerabilities to exploit. But something fundamental had shifted. The people here had remembered their collective strength, had tasted what it meant to fight back and win. That knowledge, once gained, could never be entirely taken away.